We're starting today with, well, Éamon will explain. I sent the email out last night. I don't have it in front of me. So, there's another congratulations to myself coming in. I got engaged at the weekend, so yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this episode is on Roger Casement.
I am on my way down now to let you.
I just mute some people there. Roger Casement, Francis Joseph Bigger, and there's one other who Éamon will explain at the very beginning. It's out of my head, I'm sorry. So Éamon will present for around 45 minutes or more. And while that is happening, if people feel, have a burning question in their mind, feel free to put it in the chat room. The default setting will be that it will bring you in to ask that question. So if I do that on your behalf instead, just let me know. Thanks for all the congratulations coming in there, folks. I'm blushing. So I will mute everybody and then ask Éamon to take himself off mute. And then when we go into the question and answers, as usual, we'll police ourselves with the mute button. Just give me 2 seconds. Mute all, and then I will ask Éamon to unmute.
Okay, folks, can you hear me? Thank you very much indeed. Nice to see you, Gordy. Thank you very much indeed, Connor. And nice to see everybody back on. In fact, more than ever. I'm not sure what's happening here, but I'm sure Connor's sending out free carryouts or something around the houses because we have a massive attendance this week, despite the imminence of the Christmas season. I think it's a sign of the times we're in. But if Connor could just throw up the slides, please. I just want to give the talk today a kind of a context because we're going to explore the associations of a big house on Belfast Antrim Road, just sort of a big house called Righ. And if we just think about it for a minute, Righ sadly was knocked down in the 1980s. It was a stately Victorian villa, almost at the corner of Gray's Lane, high up the Antrim Road, past Fort William Park. The back of the house really was kind of Cave Hill, and it overlooked Belfast Lough. And this sort of comfortable Victorian villa was the residence of a man called Francis Joseph Bigger. If we just go down a couple of slides there, slide 3 would be great for the moment. Thank you very much indeed, Connor. And we see F.J. Bigger. I mean, in those days, people believed that the kilt was Irish. And as part of the Gaelic revival, you had Irish dancing, you had Irish festivals called Feshina, the Glens of Antrim Fesh, for example. And that term is still used today. I heard somebody talking recently about having sang in the Coleraine Fesh, 50 years ago. So the word Fesh is a Gaelic word, an Irish word, meaning a festival of music, language, and song. And F.J. Bigger was very much central to that. And I suppose we can describe him as I have done on this slide. He was a Protestant nationalist. He was a Gaelic revivalist. He was also a very wealthy man. He had inherited family wealth from the Bigger family, who had land at Mollusk in nearby County Antrim. And of course, he was a solicitor in the town, a solicitor to some very important business families, such as the Baird family, who owned the Belfast Evening Telegraph from 1870. In many ways, F.J. Bigger was an unlikely nationalist, an unlikely Gaelic revivalist. But his impact and the impact of his circle of friends in that crescent time, as we sometimes call it, between the death of Parnell in 1891, Charles Stuart Parnell, the symbol of, if you like, Home Rule Ireland, for many, Ireland on the way to independence. Of course, Parnell was toppled in 1890 because of the O'Shea divorce scandal, his affair with an English woman who was married to an Irish nationalist MP. The scandal, I suppose, became public in 1890 because Captain William O'Shea, Catherine's Irish husband, realized that he wasn't going to get part of a legacy, a family legacy, which a wealthy aunt was expected to bestow on his wife, and realizing that the family were contesting the will and he wasn't going to get the kind of hush money he was after, he sued for divorce in the English courts. And divorce in those days was a very murky, never a pleasant business, but it was a very murky public washing of dirty linen in public, you might say. And of course, Parnell, who survived, castigation by the British establishment, accusations by the Times of London that he was a major supporter of violence in Ireland during the Land League. Parnell, of course, was finally brought down by the O'Shea divorce scandal, rejected by a majority of the party he had formed. Remember, the first modern political party in the Westminster system was the old Irish Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and Parnell died, really of a broken heart the following year at the age of 46, buried in Glasnevin. So we talk about that crescent time from the downfall of Parnell and his premature death to the Easter Rising of 1916. It's only a generation, 25 years, but that period saw the rise of the Gaelic League, because in the wake of Parnell's death, the Home Rule Party was bitterly divided into factions. You had pro-Parnellites, anti-Parnellites. You had a Catholic party led by Timothy Michael Healy, brilliant orator, brilliant intellect, but really he was kind of a bit of an individualist. Could I say he was sort of the Bob McCartney of the late Victorian age? And the result was, of course, that it wasn't until 1900, as we mentioned before, after the commemoration of the 1798 Rising 100 years before, that the various strands of constitutional nationalism, moderate home rule politics came together under John Redmond, and we're into the third Home Rule Bill and the crisis over Home Rule of 1912-14. Now, one of the products of that was this man, Francis Joseph Biggar. He was born in Belfast, probably in Donegal Street, where his family had property, in 1863. Victoria really had almost 30 years to reign on the throne. Belfast was not yet an industrial city. We have a marvelous poem about F.J. Biggar, because among the young men and women he gathered round him at the fireside of Righ in long winter evenings of poetry and song and politics in the run-up to 1916 was the Belfast poet Joseph Campbell, Joseph McCaffmoyle. Now, most of you have heard of the beautiful ballad My Lagan Love. You're probably unaware that was written by Joseph Campbell as a young man. He was the son of a wealthy builder from South Armagh who lived on the Woodstock Road. And Joseph, of course, would become one of the poets of the Gaelic Revival. His brother, Sean, was an artist of the Gaelic Revival, and he was a member of the Righ Circle, centred on in the great library of Righ, with the great kind of roaring log fire, around which Biggar entertained in those twilight years of the late 19th and kind of the Edwardian years of the 20th century. And so many people went there. I mean, I mentioned Joseph Campbell. There were regular visits. If we just go back one slide there, I think, Conor, you had Owen MacNeill, born John MacNeill, in Glenarm and the Glens of Antrim in 1867. MacNeill became known to historians as the scholar revolutionary. His father was a former sea captain who became a prosperous businessman in Glenarm. They were a Catholic family in a mixed town who did well, and the father was able to educate his sons at good schools. He sent Owen to St. Malachy's College as a boarder in the 1880s. He sent Owen's brother James, and of course Owen was known as John MacNeill at home, Gaelicized his name later. He sent his brother James to Belvedere College in Dublin. James would become an administrator of the British Empire, working for the Indian Raj, an administrator over perhaps 10 million people. Whereas Owen MacNeill would graduate from the Royal University of Ireland, become a law clerk in Dublin, then an historian, and then embrace the Irish language, which he'd heard spoken in his youth in Glenariff. It's said that in MacNeill's childhood in the 1860s, 70s, they had an old nurse in the Glens called Peggy Carnegie, and she was a Gaelic speaker from Glenariff. Irish was spoken until the 1930s in Red Bay, Glenariff, Glendun, and of course Rathlin Island, one of the last fastnesses. Antrim Irish is quite unique, a bit like Donegal Irish. And of course, MacNeill heard her say at night as she put the children down, this was a middle-class family, Be the host, agus Colossaw. he picked up these phrases. Though, in fact, when he came to learn Irish in the 1890s, it was on the Aran Islands. And of course, MacNeil would join forces with Douglas Hyde, Dr. Douglas de Hydra, from County Roscommon, the son of a Church of Ireland rector of a sort of a landed ascendancy background. And together, Hyde and MacNeil would launch Conradh the Gaeilge, the Gaelic League, in 1893. Their aim was to revive Irish as a spoken language. So MacNeil is a cultural nationalist until quite late, certainly 1916. He's a home ruler, but he wants to see an Irish-speaking Ireland. He shares Douglas Hyde's view, as does F.J. Biggar, of they favour the de-Anglicization of Ireland. Remember, language revivals were the norm all over Europe. In the Austrian Empire, among subject peoples, like the Poles, like the Czechs, like the Jews, they were reviving their language from the mid-19th century on. In Ireland, this movement was kind of transposed into the phrase gan siar gan seanga. If you don't have a language, you can't call yourself a nation. You know, something's always lost in translation. All kinds of people went to school to the Gaelic League, including members of the middle class, mainly Protestant, Belfast Naturalist Field Club, with their premises in the old museum in College Square North. MacNeil was now in Dublin in the 1890s, keeping in touch with his family in the Glen, a regular visitor to Righ, where Biggar had become chairman, or Oachtaran, of the Belfast Cóla Cantor of the Gaelic League, meeting in the hall in St Mary's Hall in Chapel Lane. A lot of people going there, very much a cross-community movement. I should say that the Gaelic League in Belfast was formed 2 years later, in 1895, in a most unlikely venue. It was founded on the Beersbridge Road in East Belfast, a few doors from where Ian Paisley lived until the 1970s. Its first chairman was a man called Dr. John Sinclair Boyd, a surgeon in the Samaritan Hospital in the Lisburn Road, a Protestant and a small U unionist who talked about this beautiful cultured language, Irish, which of course could still be heard spoken in the Glens, in South Armagh, and in the Sperrin Mountains, and of course in Belfast at this time. And all of these figures we're talking about were aware of this. Irish was spoken by the fish dealers, the Fadgies, who'd come into Belfast and Lisburn from County Louth with names like Elmore, McGillawara, but instead of Gilmore, it was translated into English as Elmore. They were living in Belfast around Marquis Street, Castle Street. You find their names, born County Louth. That's the giveaway phrase. Coming in the 1890s, early 20th century, speaking Ulster Irish, which, because the Cooley Peninsula was an extension of the South Armagh Gaeltacht, you know. So, I mean, there was a lot of Irish around. RIC men and barracks like Donegal Pass were speaking Irish. Almost all the memoirs of RIC men who found themselves north of the new border in 1922, talk about an Irish language background. We think of Patrick Shea, an RIC sergeant's son from Newry, though he was born in a barracks in the south of Ireland, educated by the Christian Brothers, became a permanent secretary in the Stormont Civil Service in 1969. Yet his father was a native Irish speaker. So you look at the 1911 census, which asked the question, do you speak Irish? And you'll find in every barracks in Belfast, you had people from Kerry, Mayo, Clare, Donegal, who were native Irish speakers. It wasn't a political thing. The Gaelic League was probably overwhelmingly Protestant in its first 10 years. And of course, that's the milieu I'm trying to get you into. So MacNeil's a regular visitor up and down from Dublin. Patrick Pearse was a visitor at Ardree, because in the decade up to 1916, Pearse was a language enthusiast, a qualified barrister. He ran Scoilana, St Enda's School in Dublin, which settled eventually in a big house at Rathfarnham in the Dublin Mountains. And there were boarders there, young men from every part of Ireland. He would find himself coming to St Mary's Hall, that ancient Catholic meeting place in the town, to address meetings of the Gaelic League. Pearse's last visit to Belfast was in March 1916, a couple of months before the Rising, when he spoke in St Mary's Hall, and then went to the huts at Broadway on the Falls Road to review the Fianna and the volunteers joining their procession up the road before staying overnight with an Irish enthusiast in Derrimore Park on the Malone Road. I know the house. And of course, Pierce used to visit a school in East Belfast, Ballyhackamore National School, which was a Catholic school, where the headmistress, Josephine MacNeil from the Glens, obviously a relation of Owen MacNeil, she ran a bilingual school when that wasn't normal. And in one of his letters to a Belfast friend, Pierce said, "I spent so long at Ballyhackamore, I had a run for my tram." Can you imagine Patrick Pierce running up the Newton Isles Road? But there it is, in the years before 1916. Just moving on to the next one again to bring Biggar back into the frame. So who was F.J. Biggar then? We've talked around him and the set of people who stayed in his house. Well, the Belfast poet Joseph Campbell, which started this diversion, wrote a poem when Biggar died in 1926 because he felt he owed so much to Biggar's inspiration, to the access to Biggar's fantastic Irish history library at Righ, to his generous purse, publishing My Lagan Love, which was always about the Belfast Lagan, not about the Lagan in County Donegal, as some people claim. Because Biggar would say, well, what do you need for this play, for this venture? Well, we need £100. That was no problem to F.J. Biggar, and he would produce the money. And Campbell remembers him. I think I see him now as in his prime, a short-built, thick-set, brown-faced, eager man, born of the seed of fighters, who time of old had fought for love of man and found their touchstone in the simple words, giving and forgiven. And he says at the end, a lover of song and music, menseful in his taste, quiet in his dress, kind to the poor, hearty in his talk, fond of a pleasant story, fast in his friendship, a reader of ancient books, a writer too, a prop of institutions, traditions, ceremonies, combative ever, but offending never. Clearly, Campbell, who died in 1944 in County Wicklow, still broadcasting at Radio Éireann with the remains of his northern accent. He owed a lot to this man, F.J. Biggar. But Biggar himself, well, Biggar, of course, his name is almost forgotten now in his native city. His tombstone in Mollusk Graveyard was blown up by paramilitaries in 1971, prompting a very interesting editorial in the following day's Irish Times by its author, Douglas Gageby, who was himself a Belfast Protestant nationalist. The irony was that Biggar has spent so much of his life putting up monuments to remember the United Irishmen and Gaelic figures. And in the end, his Celtic cross with a Gaelic inscription was blown up. Well, not quite. The Gaelic inscription is still there in Mollusk. And in the last 5 years, something amazing has happened. A smaller Celtic cross has grown out of the plinth. Now, clearly it's been put there by somebody, so Biggar still has a Celtic cross, though not on the grand scale of 1926. But of course, Biggar was a living legend in his own day. He was known throughout Ulster, indeed the whole of Ireland, for his infectious enthusiasm for Irish history, archaeology, the Irish language, and of course for his personal contribution to the preservation of castles, high crosses, and patriot graves. The name Biggar is Lowland Scots. The family originated in Nithsdale in the Scottish lowlands in the 17th century. And Biggar wrote about his ancestors. It was no fear of religious persecution, nor its result that induced them to cross Glenluce Bay in their open boat to make Donaghadee. Their main inducement was the conviction that they were coming to a freer land where opportunities were wider and prospects likely to be more satisfying. They settled in Carmoney and Mollusk, the townland there called Biggarstown. They began to thrive at farming and trade. Part of actually Crown Entry and High Street was until the 20th century known as Biggar's Entry. They issued their own kind of trade tokens dated 1657, 1666. These are preserved today, and they intermarried with the plantation stock in South Antrim, the Parkers, the Finleys, the MacNeilys. So this was the stock that Biggar came from. Presbyterian planter stock. And eventually, Biggar, of course, was the seventh son of Joseph Biggar of Ardree. And he was the seventh son of David Biggar of the Trench Mollusk. Now, Biggar had important connections. First of all, his second cousin was Joseph Gillis Biggar, Parnell's ally, the filibusterer, the man who kept the House of Commons up all night. And when the Speaker said, "The honourable member is not making himself audible to the chair." In those days, the rules of Parliament were very vague, a bit like last year's rowdiness. And Joe Biggar, known as Humpy Joe, they're very cruel in this city because he'd fallen off a horse as a young man and had a hump. He was an ardent home ruler, the member for County Cavan, with a rasping Belfast accent, but a wealthy man. He walked up to the front and says, "Not to worry, your worship, I'll start all over again," and began to read the previous 300 pages on drains in Staffordshire or pigs in Cornwall, because he couldn't get Ireland onto the agenda. He was backed by Parnell. The rest is history. Joe Biggar was a prosperous pork butcher. He didn't sell the meat himself, but he made a fortune from it. And his funeral through Belfast in 1890 was an amazing occasion. F.J. Biggar was at that funeral. He admired his cousin, who had been secretly a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But the ancestor that this man, Francis Joseph Biggar, or Frank Biggar, was proudest of was his grandfather, who had been a volunteer at the Battle of Antrim in 1798, who fought with the United Irishmen. And he was very, very proud of him. Why did he call his house Ardree? That's very interesting. The only part of the house remaining are the two gateposts and the beautiful overgrown garden. They built a couple of new houses on the site, but the garden, you can see the remains of Victorian decency as it descends in parterres towards the loch below. I mean, I've been there, I've done a bit of filming there. It's an interesting sight, so wrapped in history. And if you go there today, you'll notice that it says Ardree. Well, you probably know that's the Irish for High King, which kind of encapsulates Biggar's Gaelic vision. But on the other side of the gatepost is written Ardery, Ardery. And that's the key to Ardree, because his mother, of whom he was immensely fond, was Mary Jane Ardery of Banbridge, a woman of great sweetness of character, he writes. And of course, the house was called Ardery after her. But when he got involved in the Gaelic revival, he turned the gatepost round and had a new name inscribed, Ardree. And of course, it was as a child, not terribly robust. He was sent to relatives in the summer, and this is hard to believe today, amidst the green fields and tonic breezes of Carmoney. He talks about climbing Carmoney Hill. You can still do that. Of going through the byways of Mollusk, where people spoke in Ulster Scots, and they still remembered the turnout of 1798 and the pitch campings and hangings that took place. Nearby was Rockfort, the village where Henry John McCracken gathered his men for the Battle of Antrim. Nearby was the Liberty Tree, which is still standing, flowing elegantly in the fields at Craigorogan near Mollusk. It's an amazing part of the country. And if you go out there in the car, these lockdown days, you'll find if you go from Mollusk Graveyard, where Biggar lies beside Jemmy Hope, and then drive to Mollusk, drive to Rockfort a mile away, you will see a great signage put up by the local council telling you where to look, what happened where in that area in 1798. But of course, there was no signage then. And the young boy, 14, 15, talking to old people who would tell him that their ancestors had been involved. And there was still a sort of a spirit of that liberal Protestant ethos around in Mollusk at that time, because it was very much a rural area, unchanged since the plantation. Biggar, the family moved to Liverpool for a while, then they came back home, and he was sent to the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. We know it as Inst, beside the Black Man statue. It had been designed as a university before Queen's was formed, with its own medical school, and became the most prestigious, I suppose, Presbyterian school in the province of Ulster. He was decided to become a solicitor. He was articled to a local firm. And then in 1884, the 21-year-old Francis Joseph went to Dublin to read law. And there he met his future business partner, a man called George Strahan. If you walk down Royal Avenue today, you'll still see the plaque, Biggar and Strahan. The firm is still there. And together they explored the ancient sites and castles of County Dublin. Biggar was always seen looking for old books on Antrim and Down in 98 in the bookstalls round the quays in Dublin. And his library of 6,000 volumes is a tremendous resource and is now in Belfast Central Library. Became a solicitor, came back to Belfast to practice. It must be said that he could do the law, but he had no great burning interest in the law. At the drop of a hat, Biggar was out of the office, leaving a client bewildered as he rushed down High Street to discover that men had discovered bones outside the ancient churchyard of St. George's. "Stop everything," said Biggar. "Those are the bones of Henry John McCracken." How did he know? Nobody knows. He brought them up to the 1798 museum in his Antrim Road home, where he revered them until somebody eventually said a few years later, "You know, Frank, I think you should give those bones a decent burial." And of course, only Biggar could do it. He sought the permission of the McCracken family to open their grave in Clifton Street and add the bones that had been found in High Street. Well, there's tens of thousands of people buried in the old churchyard in High Street. And I think McCracken still lies. His grave was supposed to be beside the blue door of the church. If you look at the church head on at the Albert Clock, on the right-hand side, there's a blue door. McCracken's remains are believed to be there because the old rector told me that his predecessor told him that two old ladies used to come right down to the 1930s and leave flowers there because they said their grandfather had attended the funeral of Henry John McCracken, and that's where he lay. But this didn't worry Biggar. The remains were interred, and of course he built up his museum, pikes, death masks, Jemmy Hope and others, paintings of the volunteers. He was really on his way as an antiquarian. He joined the Naturalist Field Club, he joined the Gaelic League, he was involved in discussions, a popular speaker with a readiness of speech. Now, he'd never got a university degree in history. He was one of those self-taught, instinctive historians, amateur archaeologists. But sometimes he stretched, of course, the bounds of history too far. As when in 1902 he decided that St. Patrick was buried in the cathedral graveyard in Downpatrick, and so he donated a great boulder of Mourne granite. I was there last Saturday for a walk around, and there it was, Pod Righ. An American was arrested 10 years ago for stealing a chunk to bring back to the land of Uncle Sam. Yet we have a photograph of it being unveiled in 1900. Nonetheless, you know, Biggar was known in every parish in the north of Ireland. In 1911, he acquired an old tower house, a Norman castle in Ardglass. This is the famous Jordan's Castle still standing. But Biggar couldn't accept it was a Norman castle in that unplanted part of County Down that was ruled by John de Courcy. And instead, he renamed it Shane's Castle, Castle Kine. Well, I mean, Shane O'Neill was never near the castle. It was a Norman castle. But there in the summers of 1911, 1912, 1913, Biggar brought from South Derry the uilleann piper Francie MacPeake, the father of them all. And there he brought Lord Ashburn, McGill of Righ, an aristocratic Gaelic speaker from County Meath. He brought Mrs. Alice Stopford Green, who was writing books about Irish nationality. He brought Shane Leslie from Monaghan, who captured Biggar in a novel as Francis Joseph MacNeil, a repairer of high crosses. He brought Cathal O'Byrne from the Falls Road, a young Gaelic poet and actor who would raise thousands for the people burnt out of their houses in the 1920s in New York, and who would die in 1957 in his native city, having written a brilliant book about old Belfast, As I Roved Out by Cathal O'Byrne. Biggar encouraged all of these young people, Joseph Campbell reciting his poems, Dennis McCullough and Bulmer Hobson recruiting for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and his great friend Roger Casement, who used Ardrey and the castle in Ardglass as kind of pied-à-terres, as kind of bases when he came from Ireland, came to Ireland from foreign parts, often suffering from malaria. There's an amazing, I sometimes walk the county down coast with my wife there, that lovely Lecale path between Ardtoll Church and Ballyhornan. where you're walking, looking over at Guns Island, where a French ship lies from 1798, a ship called L'Amité, which sank there trying to bring weapons to the United Irishmen. And I've seen a photograph of F.J. Biggar, Roger Casement, and a group of country people coming up that lane from St. Patrick's Well, carrying a cross of winds around 1910 or thereabouts. Now, Biggar was a member by this stage of the Church of Ireland, very high church. He worshipped in St. George's in High Street. But he must be the only Protestant who wrote a pamphlet for the Catholic Truth Society with its nihil obstat, no objection from the Catholic hierarchy. And it's a little pamphlet published in the early 20th century called An Drochil, the Bad Times, about the penal days and the penal laws in Ireland. Now, of course, Biggar was regarded as eccentric with his own kind of social class, I suppose. It's often said he had two different nights in his house. One for his Gaelgory and advanced nationalist friends, and one for, his key customers, his clients, people like, for example, the birds of the Belfast Telegraph, and near the twain did meet. His brother, of course, Sir Edward Coy Biggar, who was knighted by the Crown, was the chief medical officer of health in Dublin right through the flu pandemic of 1918. Another brother was Colonel Frederick Biggar, who was prominent in the British Army. It's funny, they all remained friends, even though they differed in politics and cultural interests. They always remained friends. And Biggar had a housekeeper from County Louth called Bridget Matthews. And she, of course, was the life and soul of the party. Roger Casement's last letter from Pentonville prison on the eve of his execution was to Bridget, recalling the old days and asking that Cathal O'Byrne, the folk singer, would sing The Castle of Dromore in his memory. The mourning suit that Roger Casement, gentleman to the end, was hanged in was sent from Righ by his friend F.J. Biggar. A dress suit sent from this man's house on the Antrim Road clothed Roger Casement as he mounted the scaffold in 1916. So Biggar's involved in all of these things, but he fell out with Belfast Central Library. Sorry, he fell out with the Linen Hall Library because around this time, 1907, he was asked to give a lecture, as you are, to the Linen Hall Library, and F.J. Biggar said, no problem. He would give a lecture on the Holy Hills of Ireland. Well, that sounded harmless enough. The Holy Hills of Ireland, the ancient round towers. Sounds very good. However, when the members of the Linen Hall Library, mainly middle-class unionists, although a very liberal institution, gathered that evening, they were horrified to hear Biggar orate and say that from every one of the holy hills of Ireland, you could see the garrison of the conqueror. All hell broke out. He was banned from membership of the library. And in a final act of revenge, he donated his books to the public library in Royal Avenue. That's why they're there to this day, along with some of his papers. He came under the watchful eye of the authorities. In 1906, he helped Joe Devlin to win the West. West Belfast was the cockpit, seesawed between unionism and nationalism. Victories were on narrow margins. But Biggar was very helpful. He got a friend of his called Alex Carlyle, who was a manager at Harland and Wolff and a brother-in-law of Lord Perry, the managing director of the shipyard. And they were Protestant home rulers. And he got him to run in West Belfast as an independent unionist, which in fact Carlyle wasn't. He was more of an independent nationalist. And Biggar was his agent. Now, obviously, his focus was the Shankill Road during this highly contested election on the question of home rule versus the Union. And of course, Biggar couldn't hold meetings for his candidate, but he plastered the Shankill Road with candidates. Support the honest unionists, support Carlyle. Carlyle got 150 votes, enabling Joe Devlin to squeeze in by 16 votes. So he's a man in the background during this whole period. Close ties to, revolutionary nationalism. So the RIC began to watch him. And of course, he confides to a friend in Dublin in 1907, to Mrs. Alice Stopford Green. He says that the spies of Dublin Castle were ghosting people in Belfast in a very Russian way. This followed a motor tour of Irish-speaking parts of Donegal by Biggar, who had a great motor car and a marvellous camera, which he used a lot, in the company of Patrick Pearse. Now, Patrick Pearse was a man for the police to watch. By the outbreak of the First World War, the RIC had no doubts about the subversive leanings of this Antrim Road solicitor, historian. A secret police report of November 1914 noted, and I quote, and F.J. Biggar, whose associates are all extremists. Mr. Biggar is constantly visited by leading Sinn Féiners, such as Bulmer Hobson, Sean McDermott, Dennis McCullough, Ernest Blythe. He has also been seen with James Connolly of the Transport Workers' Union. He does not bear a good moral character and is said to hate British rule. Well, this is a slur, I think, on Biggar. Although it's fair to say, he did gather round him a group of acolytes who were young men. All of them are very fiercely loyal to Biggar, as they were to Casement. And there's no evidence of any impropriety. But he did encourage these young men to visit the graveyards of 98, to learn the Irish language, and to envisage Ireland as a nation. While it's often said, Dennis McCullough said that when the talk after one of the great Cayley nights, when the whiskey flowed, when the talk overflowed into the morning, Biggar had to get up early to open the office, and he would get into his old Ford motor car and head off. Once he heard the talk getting too kind of subversive, he was off. And on one occasion, the house was raided. The police were looking for the IRB men, Dennis McCullough and Bulmer Hobson, and they escaped through a little gap in the hedge. And Biggar had a special gate built in his garden and called it the Gate of Liberty in memory of this event. But the thing was, of course, he seemed unaware. As Casement talked about Biggar in these days to Mrs. Green. He said that, he stayed a lot in Biggar's, but he said, Mr. Biggar is a pipe and banner maniac. And that kind of sums him up. He was a Freemason. He loved pomp and ceremony. His Ireland was going to have a lot of marching. He encouraged the Irish volunteers from 1913, but he seemed to have no intuition as to where this was all moving towards the rebellion of 1916, actual bloodshed. His young friend, Joseph Connolly from the Falls Road, not James Connolly, Joseph Connolly from Alexander Street West, who became a key figure in Sinn Féin, a minister in the Dáil later. He said that he went along to Biggar in the Irish Volunteers. He knew there was going to be a rising. And he went to Biggar and said about March 1916, look, Frank, I need to make my will, and you're a lawyer. And Biggar said, don't be daft. Why would a young man of you at 23 want to make your will? He said, because I might die in the revolution. Not at all. There's going to be no revolution. Don't be daft. I'm not going to make your will. And Joe Connolly was amazed at this attitude because he felt Biggar had instilled revolution in young hearts, and now he was kind of disowning the whole business. 1916 came as a shock to Biggar. So many of his friends and associates were impacted by the rising. Casement was arrested in County Kerry, executed. Dennis McCullough was sent off to Frongach. Owen MacNeill was arrested and sentenced to penal servitude as a result of his involvement in the volunteers, and he had tried to stop the rising. Joseph Connolly was sent off to Frongach, and he couldn't believe it. And the violence that followed in Belfast by 1920 was vicious and sectarian. Biggar began to take more of a back seat. He'd also been involved in the revival of the theatre. The stories told about Bulmer Hobson and others going to Dublin to show their plays to Yeats, who, wasn't terribly impressed by the revival in the north. And on the way home on the train, in 1904, they said, to hell with Yeats. We'll start our own theatre. We'll write our own plays. And the Ulster Literary Theatre was born, with plays by the Morrow brothers and others. It was very much nationalist propaganda on the minor stage of the Ulster Hall, and Biggar was in the background, funding the publication of an IRB paper called Ulster at that time, with writings by people like Hobson and McDermott and so on. So you have this abiding love for Ireland, and all of that there. And he marks the graves of people like Steele Dixon, Mary Ann McCracken in Clifton Street Graveyard. He died in December 1926, and he was buried in Mollusk Graveyard on a beautiful summer's day when it seemed that the earth had stood still. you know, he wasn't married. His house was bought by Joe Devlin, the nationalist politician. And apart from his books and his memoirs, his memory was forgotten. But one day in 1978, when I was obviously only about 5 years old, I was sitting in the National Library in Dublin doing research. And Donal O'Looney, the librarian, came out and he said, Éamon, I've got great news. We've just got papers in, documents from a man called F.J. Biggar in Belfast. And they had been donated by Bridget Matthews, his loyal, lifelong housekeeper, who had, you know, folded his arms in death and carried out his last wishes. And his last wish was that his political letters and the letters from Casement should not go to Belfast, but should go to Dublin, that she should look after them all her life before transferring them. So F.J. Biggar, moving on a little bit, because I've talked a lot about him. He's a key figure. The next slide, maybe, please. And this man. I want to say something about this man. I probably want to say a lot more than I'll have time to say. But Roger David Casement. He's an exact contemporary of Biggar's, 1864. And they became friends. He's a regular house guest at Righ. He's involved in Feis na Lan, launched by Biggar and his young friends in 1904. Casement was actually born in County Dublin at Sandy Cove in 1864. The house is marked with a plaque. He was the son of Roger Casement, Colonel Roger Casement, who was a British Army officer from County Antrim, and Annie Jeffson, who was from a Catholic gentry family in County Cork. The Casements were a mixed marriage. And his father, whose grave is in Ballymena Graveyard, I got the shock of my life there. I was in Ballymena just before the pandemic, giving a talk. Went down at lunchtime to walk around, went into the graveyard, and I suddenly saw Roger Casement. Well, this wasn't Sir Roger Casement's grave, this was his father's. But Roger Casement's father, of course, had mildly nationalist leanings, despite his military background. He'd fought with Louis Kossuth and the Hungarian nationalists in 1848. And Casement defended his father and said that he was very much devoted to Ireland and Irish independence. And that's very, very interesting. The Jeffsons were from County Tipperary, I might have said Cork. And the family were a Manx family. They had come to Ireland in the 18th century when a British officer called Hugh Casement, Casement was the Gaelic spoken of the Isle of Man, very like Ulster Irish. Hugh Casement married the daughter of the rector of Ballinderry. And they soon acquired Maher and Temple House, a bleak Georgian mansion near Ballycastle. You'll see it on the mountain road from Cushendun to Ballycastle. And this was the Casement family home. Now, of course, there were a number of children. Nina was born in 1856, then Charles, then Tom, who was very close to Roger and a very strong nationalist, and Roger David in 1864. The mother, though, was conflicted between her bringing up her children in the established church and her own cradle faith of Catholicism. And on a visit to Righ in Wales, when the children were small, she had them secretly baptized as Catholics. Nonetheless, Roger Casement and his siblings were brought up as Protestants. His mother died when he was 9, and he was left in the care of his father. The family were living in the Adair Arms Hotel in Ballymena, occasionally in there for a bowl of soup. I often think that this is where Roger Casement, you know, ran up and down these corridors as a boy in the Adair Arms Hotel. But his father became more and more eccentric. To try to contact his dead wife, he got involved in spiritualism, and he died suddenly after a seance there. The family were sent to Maher and Temple, the big house in Ballycastle, to be reared by the much more unionist Casement. And Roger was sent to the diocesan school, now Ballymena Academy, as a boarder. Nobody really seemed to want Mr. Roger Casement. He was farmed out between relatives on the Ban and relatives in Fort Brouch. And in the 1870s, as he's growing into maturity, they're asking, what will we do with Roger David? Well, at the school in Ballymena, he formed a friendship with the headmaster's son, Travers King, and he discovered much later that the Reverend Robert King, the minister who was principal, was a fluent Irish speaker. This led to a problem later on when Casement was famous and had been knighted. The headmaster of Ballymena Academy wrote to him and said, "Sir Roger, you're our most famous old boy. Will you send us a few guineas. Casement wrote back, when I was a student, the word Ireland was never mentioned. The Irish language was never mentioned, even though there were teachers on the staff who could speak it. I'm sending my money to Mr. Pearce's school in Dublin. He kind of thought, only in Ballymena could this happen. Tom Fullert in the head now, Sir Roger, we do our very best. We do not reconsider. Only in Ballymena would they have come back looking money. We don't know what happened. Casement, of course, would enter the Elliott Dempster shipping line at the age of 20, and he went to Africa. In fact, he had visited Africa 3 times by the end of his 20th year, and he got to know the dark continent very well in this period, working as a purser on the ship, discovering Africa, and then, of course, in 1895, at the age of 30, joining the British consular service. He served, of course, very famously, first in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo, we would say modern Zaire, where, of course, he was responsible for a damning report on the brutal treatment of the native people under the King of the Belgians, Leopold II. And, of course, this won him, of course, a royal award at that time. And of course, he was then promoted to Consul General in Rio de Janeiro. And it was there in Peru that he again inquired into the ill treatment of the Indian native rubber gatherers by the Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company. And again, he wrote a damning report. In fact, Roger Casement, in his 40s, is emerging as the author of the first human rights report, a great humanitarian, keeping meticulous diaries. Now, of course, he was gay, something that he kept very, very quiet. He had gay lovers, a lot of gay lovers, it seemed, in this period. But this was not on the public radar. Bulmer Hobson denied to his dying day in 1968 that Casement was a homosexual. But Shane Leslie, of course, it was frowned on in those days, perfectly legal now. But in those days, of course, there was a stigma about homosexuality, apart from the fact that it was illegal. Very, very different from the more liberal society today, where human rights are recognized. And the result was that Roger Casement, at that time, was being, obviously came under the purview of the police and the security services on his Irish visits. There is a letter from Sir Shane Leslie, a friend of Casement's, a friend of Biggers, a regular visitor to Biggers' houses, who said that the Biggers discovered a trunk left in their house in 1916 after Casement died. And they waited for something like 10 years before they opened it. And Bigger was dying himself. He wanted to open the trunk. He'd heard all the rumors about Casement, which had been used against him to deny him an act of clemency during his trial in 1916. And Sir Shane Leslie wrote to a nationalist MP in the 1960s, what we discovered there, we were forced to commit to the flames. So we assume it was more evidence of his sexual orientation. Nonetheless, of course, Casement would return to Ireland in the early 1900s. He became, if you like, turned off the family home at Maharan Timper. He describes arriving there at Christmas Day, 1904, just Christmas. He gets the train from Ballymena. He found the house uninviting. He writes, cold and bleak. I will not go there again. Christmas Day, 1904 was no better. Miserable day. All except me went to church. On the 28th of December, he escaped up to Portrush to see his sister Nina, calling at the Ascendancy House of the Youngs. Rose Young, the big house Gaelic revivalist, and her sister Charlotte were friends. It's very interesting that even from the Tower of London, on his death watch, he sent love to Rose Young and Charlotte from the Tower. Quite amazing, those friendships that transcended class, politics, from Casement, the revolutionary, to the unionist big house, because he was sculpted from that stock himself. But of course, he was a prominent figure at the First Glens Feis in 1904. We have a marvellous letter to Owen MacNeill in Dublin, the founder of the Gaelic League, from his sister, in Ballymena. She was Mrs. Annie McGavock. And this is what she writes. March 1904, they called a meeting in Cushendall School to launch a feis to celebrate the Irish language still spoken, music and song. And she writes to her brother Owen in Dublin, Mr. Clark, one of the Gaelic League activists in the area, told me that a meeting on Sunday week in Cushendall, he said a few words about the movement. And when he finished, a tall, soldierly looking man came over to him and said, I agree heartily with all you have said, as these have been my own thoughts for years. Mr. Clark thought no more of the incident, but on Friday he got a letter from the gentleman telling him he is greatly interested in the feis, hopes he will be here at the time, but as he's going to South Africa soon, he fears he may have to leave before 30th of June. He subscribes £5, and here's the punchline. Mr. Clark says he can't believe that the Casement of Ballycastle could hold such views. They were tyrants in the old days. So Roger Casement, a man of two worlds, and of course, this is the beginning of Casement's gravitation to Irish nationalism. He attends the feis in June 1905. He charts a boat to bring the Gaelic-speaking Rachri men, the Rathlin Islanders, over. He meets the company of Dennis McCullough, Owen McNeill, Bulmer Hobson. They become fast friends. And of course, he becomes a key figure, retiring from the consular service, never using his title Sir Roger. He briefly flirts with Home Rule. He addresses a Home Rule meeting in Ballymoney in 1913. He produces a pro-Home Rule covenant for Protestants to sign. But then by 1914, he's at a meeting in Cork with Owen McNeill to launch the Irish Volunteers. So these two great Northerners are on the platform in Cork City Hall. And McNeill, of course, had been writing that Casement, that Carson was rekindling the flame of Irish separatism. And he called for 3 chairs for Carson and the UVF. This wasn't really a wise thing to do in Cork in 1914. And literally 3 chairs were, instead of 3 cheers, 3 chairs were thrown at the platform. And Casement had to rescue Owen McNeill from the mob. Nonetheless, he became a promoter of the Volunteers, and he became close to the IRB and Inner Council. In 1914, Casement went on his fatal mission to the United States and then to Berlin to seek the support of the German government to provide military help for an Irish uprising. He wanted arms and men. He didn't get, of course, the men, but he got 20,000 rifles. A derisory number. He failed to raise a credible Irish brigade among the Irish prisoners of war. In fact, a sergeant from the Falls Road called John Robinson was one of the chief prosecution witnesses at Casement's trial. Robinson described how this bearded man with a cultured upper-class Irish accent came in and said, look, lads, you're going to have to join the Volunteers and fight for Irish freedom. And most of them said he was a traitor to Mr. Redmond and the cause of Home Rule. This was evidence in chief. And of course, as the rising, of course, was being planned secretly, Casement embarks on his final mission. He's on board a submarine, the U-19, which is approaching the Kerry coast, accompanied by the armed ship, the Odd. He's dropped off the coast because the armed ship is intercepted by the Royal Navy. And Casement is arrested the following day, discovered by children at the old fort at Lonely Bannistrand. But of course, Casement by that stage was trying to stop the rising. He realized 20,000 rifles wouldn't cut it. He's brought to Tralee. There's a plot to rescue him. It doesn't work out. He's brought to the Tower of London. He's stood on trial for his life. The rising goes ahead without him. And of course, it becomes a glorious failure. A propaganda success. Casement is the last man connected with it to be executed. He is prosecuted by F.E. Smith, a supporter of the Larne gun running, the conservative, if you like, Lord Chancellor in the government. He prosecutes, of course, he's Attorney General then, he prosecutes Roger Casement for his life. It's a very interesting trial. We can talk about how he's prosecuted under a 1351 statute for levying war against the king. A very interesting defense. It doesn't work. He's condemned to death. He's executed on the 3rd of August. And he enters the pantheon, of course, of Irish nationalist martyrs. It's not till 1965, after a huge debate about the veracity or otherwise of the Black Diaries. His supporters trying to prove they're forgeries. One of them was, but most are not. We now know that. His detractors saying that he was, if you like, a homosexual, that he was, disabled by this from any role in public life. And in the end, of course, his remains are brought back under a Labour government in 1965 with De Valera officiating, not at Murlough Bay where he wanted to be buried, but in Glasnevin Cemetery, Roger Casement. His role in history is interesting, a major controversial figure, seen as a traitor by unionism, by the British establishment, seen as a hero by Irish nationalists who called the Belfast GAA Park after him in 1953, seen as a great humanitarian today, an anti-slavery campaigner, of course, as Roger Sawyer stresses. One of the first people to recognize the significance of Carson's army, that Carson had reignited the Fenian flame. One of the first people to argue that you had to persuade Ulster Protestants, like himself, to take their part in the Irish nation. He certainly believed in that. An outsider politically, an outsider socially, an outsider sexually at that time. One story I'll tell you to round off today, because I could talk all day about this man, and that is an interesting story. John McDermott became Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland in the 1980s. He was a former Northern Ireland cabinet minister. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister in East Belfast. In 1916, John McDermott went to Dublin for the day on Easter Monday and became trapped in the Rising and had to make his way back to Belfast on a very hairy journey. He became one of the last members of the old All-Ireland Bar. And he wrote an autobiography for family circulation for the very legalistic McDermott family. And I'm indebted to the present Sir John McDermott, former judge, for letting me see this, because, of course, a story is told in that autobiography, unpublished, of a discussion in the McDermott Rectory, or Manse in Belfast, in August 1916, as Casement has been executed. Reading the paper, the young barrister John McDermott, future Unionist minister and judge, said, "Oh, that traitor is being executed today at Pentonville. He'll be no loss." His father interrupted him, the Reverend John McDermott. He said, "I want you to listen to this," he said. "When I was a young man, I was a student for the ministry. I was up on holiday in Ballycastle about 1904. I was swimming in the harbour and I got into difficulties. I was drowning. And I looked up and a man in Donegal tweeds with a beard was on the platform at the docks. He threw off his boots and dived in and saved my life. That man was Roger Casement. It could only happen in Ireland." Thank you very much.
Excellent. Éamon, as always, let me just take this
Thank
off.
you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Éamon.
Really good. We have a couple of reflections and a couple of fascinating pieces of history. I'd like to bring in Julita first with a couple of great nuggets. Julita.
Yes, Julita, go ahead.
Yes. Hello there, Éamon. Fascinating.
How are you, Julita? Nice to see you again. You're becoming a regular. You're probably demented with all these links.
No, well, the links, I'm not very technical, but they're fascinating talks, and just thank you very much, and to Conor. Just a couple of points there. You mentioned the Cork City Hall. That was in December 1913.
That's right.
My grandfather Fawcett was actually the organizer. He had started with three others, the Cork Volunteers, and he invited Casement, and he was the one who had to stand up. They were throwing chairs and doing all sorts of things, and he said, "Will you refuse Casement a hearing?" And he told how well he was received all over the world, and yet here they were in Cork refusing him. And it kind of, other people got Casement out, but they brought him to order, and they got the disruptors went out, and they got quite a huge amount joined up that night. Also, there was just one other point about James McNeill. I just wonder, would you know, I know James was an Indian doing all of that, but I came across a letter from him to De Valera in the papers in UCD, where he's mentioning Alec Wilson, who you talked about before,
Yes.
and Orville Williams, and that he had met them in May, and they talked about trying to do work to build understanding north-south, and he had felt it was too early. You know, the truce hadn't happened, and he didn't want to favour amateur diplomacy. But he was telling De Valera that he was now going to go to Belfast to meet them again. And he's mentioned in a letter from Wilson to my grandfather, who was up in Belfast at that time, that he was coming up on the evening train. And I just wondered, is that the same James McNeill? The UCD archives don't actually reveal that.
What date is this?
He just writes to the... It's the 25th of November, 1921.
1921. Oh no, it's certainly the same James McNeill.
Yeah.
No, the McNeills are always, even Owen
Okay.
was up and down to County Antrim to see the relatives all the time during this period.
Yeah.
And James McNeill, not only were they up to County Antrim, but Owen McNeill had married a woman called, I'm not sure, she was known as Tabby in the family, Agnes Moore. Agnes Moore's brother was Dr. J.B. Moore, the father of the playwright, Brian Moore. You know, Brian Moore, the doctor's wife, the lonely passion of Judith Parent. Now, he had a medical, he was a doctor in the Mater Hospital, and they lived in Clifton Street in the city centre, beside the beautiful Clifton House. And anyway, so all the McNeills go up and stay in that house when they come north.
Yeah.
And James McNeill was a regular. So he would have known Alex Wilson. Now, people will not be aware of our previous discussions about this, but Alex Wilson is a very interesting man. He was actually the son of one of the founders of Belfast Shipyard, Walter Wilson, who along with Harland and Wolff and Perry established the shipyard in the 1870s, 1880s. He died about 1905, and his son Alex was really, he was the financial director of Harland and Wolff, born into the family. And they lived in a mansion called Beaver Park, which they hired from the Earls of Deramore on the outskirts of South Belfast, a beautiful forest park. And Wilson lived there to about 1922. Now, the thing about Alex Wilson was they were old plantation stock, but he was a devotee of the Irish language, involved in the Gaelic League, a Protestant home ruler. He's described as a mugwump in correspondence around 1914. A mugwump was somebody who was neither foul nor flesh, a kind of an alliance party type figure, you know, and he was considered unreliable. He supported, like Redmond, Irish men in the First World War, but he supported Irish industries and Irish-speaking Ireland. And he would have known McNeill because in 1914, when Casement was helping with Owen McNeill to set up the Irish Volunteers, I have a document whereby Alex Wilson arranged a firing range on his estate, which would be used on consecutive nights by Carson's volunteers and Redmond's volunteers. And they would use this together. The idea was to forge links across the sectarian divide and avoid civil war. So after the war, Wilson is still very much moving in these circles. And he wouldn't have met very many educated Catholics. So to meet James McNeill, of course, who had gone to Cambridge, entered the Indian Civil Service, very successful, and then in 1916 returns to Ireland to become Sinn Féin chairman of Dublin County Council, and then, of course, Governor General of the Free State. I'll tell you a very funny story. I knew the late Moira Comerford, who was the secretary to the First Dáil when I was doing research in Dublin in the 70s. And I remember Moira telling me that during the Irish Civil War, 1922-3, she was on the run and she had to get out and go to England. And on the boat, didn't she meet a friend of hers, Josephine Ahern, who had been in Common the Mon and had just married James McNeill. And they were on their honeymoon. And of course, she was a Republican on the run from the Free State government, and McNeill was a paragon of the Free State. He was High Commissioner in London. And Josephine McNeill said, "Oh, you'll have to join us for dinner. You'll have to join us for tea." And so she found the safest place to be was at McNeill's table on the boat from Dublin, because nobody bothered her and nobody recognized her as a Republican woman, just by the way.
Very good.
Brilliant. Thank you. Ruth has made a reflection that there's a mollusk heritage trail. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Ruth.
Yes, Ruth.
Maybe not. It's just
well, I'll pick up on what Ruth has been saying. Maybe if she wants to come in. I mean, they've developed it powerfully. If you go to the graveyard in Mollusk, you'll see the graves of F.J. Bigger, you will see the grave of Jimmy Hope, the weaver, Battle of Antrim, a fearless individual, totally anti-sectarian. Just read his autobiography of a working class United Irishman. You'll see what anti-sectarianism means. And then, of course, you have a lamp standard from the days of the body snatchers, an old font from the medieval church on the site. And then you go up the road and you're into 1798 territory. You'll come to Craig O'Rogan Rath, where McCracken raised the green flag in 1798 before the Battle of Antrim. There's an ancient cairn there, which is called Carn Grania, the grave of the sun in the field, and a liberty tree from 1798. It's one of the most interesting areas on the northern outskirts of Belfast. Once you get by all the car sales rooms and get out to the old Mollusk, and the local people, some of whom I've spoken to, the real local people, have a total folk memory of that whole period, frozen in time.
Okay, I'm going to bring Jared Mulholland in, and then I think Harold Good's looking in as well. Is that right, Harold? Yeah, bring in after Jared. Go ahead, Jared.
Éamon, just a question. I understand Roger Casement's dying request was to be buried in North Antrim, Murlough Bay. Is that correct? And if it is, should we be doing something about it, or maybe it's too politically difficult?
Yes, indeed, you're absolutely correct. He expressed a wish to be buried at Murlough Bay, a place he loved and wrote poetry about. I mean, in the early 20th century, there's some lovely poems by Casement, Autumn Day at Glenariff, and other poems which I must dig out for some of these sessions just to give you a flavour. I mean, Casement really became involved very emotionally in the Gaelic revival and the sense of a new kind of Ireland, very much so. But of course, he converted to Catholicism during his final days in prison before his execution. But the thing about Casement was, of course, that that request was repeated and repeated. And when finally his remains were repatriated, thanks to the intervention of Shane Leslie, who was a cousin of Churchill. The Leslies of Glaslough in County Monaghan were cousins of Churchill. Their mothers were American and were sisters. And he used his influence in the 50s with Churchill to raise the question of bringing back Casement's remains. And some work was done, wasn't achieved, but when Labour came in 64, the Wilson government agreed, provided there was no question of him being buried north of the border. And if you go on your tour of Glasnevin today, which the guides will do, they will tell you that Roger Casement is under several hundred weight of cement in case anyone ever disinterred the remains and brought them northwards as some kind of a political stunt. So I don't think it's likely to happen. And if you're going to do something about it, I think you're not going to achieve very much.
Thank you, Jared. Harold.
Yes, thank you again, Eamon, for a
Reverend Harold, how are you?
wonderful afternoon. And I was particularly interested in the Roger Casement story. That's a wonderful story you told just at the end with the connection with the McDermott family.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's I know McDermott. In fact, John McDermott is a neighbour of mine here, so he wouldn't be
well,
here.
Can I suggest, ask Judge McDermott if he would let you see the family history, because he showed it to me, and you'll read that story. It's quite amazing, really. A story of his father in Dublin as a young man. They're all 7 foot tall and lived to be 90 something. You know?
Oh yeah, it's amazing. But very interesting. I spent a lot of my time in Ballycastle.
Yes, I know.
And I know the scene there. But I kneel at the communion table in the parish church in Ballyvoy. There's an inscription that this sanctuary has been made available as a gift of the Casement family in memory of Sir Roger Casement. I was very puzzled by that until I discovered that it was a different Roger Casement.
Absolutely.
They're a member of the family, but I mean, they are there. Roger Casement is a folk hero amongst the people up in that area, but not so much with the Casement family who are still there.
Absolutely, the Casement family, of course. And if you look at the Casement family today, they're very often on Carrick-a-Reid Bridge when Prince Charles visits, and with their beards, they're spitting images of Roger Casement. Certainly the last time I saw them on Carrick-a-Reid with Prince Charles on television, I thought, my goodness, Roger Casement will never be dead while these men walk. But the thing is, until 2016, when the centenary of the Rising, RD's name, they actually admitted, was never mentioned. They never encouraged the media to come into the house where Casement sojourned in those days before 1905. And yet, there's a great story. When 2016 came around, they suddenly acknowledged Roger Casement, a new generation. And they told a marvelous story. And that was that in the 1960s, one of the Casements in Ballycastle was off the west coast of Ireland in a boat. And he put into Dingle, or that area, North Kerry, the Dingle Peninsula. The boat had engine trouble and he needed parts. And he was referred to a particular firm who could fix him. And he said, look, the boat's failed me. I'm hoping to go around the coast of Ireland. Can you help me? What's your name? And he said something like, Patrick Casement. Where are you from? Maharan Temple House, Ballycastle. And he said, well, look, will you come back in a couple of days, stay local? So we came back in a couple of days and they said, we're terribly sorry. He said, we fixed your boat, but we took longer than expected. And anyway, there's no charge. We couldn't charge the Casements after what happened to Sir Roger in 1916. And I heard the Casements tell that story 4 years ago on RTE. So it's amazing how, in the backward glance of history, time is a great healer, and how we can all identify with the human tragedies of the past 100 years on, but maybe not the ones that are happening today, as we saw in recent days. It's very easy to say, yes, 100 years ago, we can empathize. But perhaps in our own day, people find that more difficult.
I find very interesting, you just touched on it, the alternative covenant.
Yes.
I was reading about Armour of Armoy, who drafted an alternative covenant in 1912, and Roger Casement came to the meeting that Armour was asking people to come to, and he wanted people to sign an alternative covenant, but had very little support for it. But what brought him into that relationship? I'd be very interested just if you made another comment about that. It's such an amazing story.
Yes. That meeting, of course, was called in Ballymoney. The man behind that meeting was F.J. Bigger. He wanted a statement from Home Rule North Antrim. Ballymoney was a home rule town. The Presbyterian community had been involved in the land question, the tenant right movement, and as you say, the powerful voice there was the Reverend James Brown Armour of Ballymoney, J.B. Armour, who had been born during the Great Famine, had seen an eviction as a child at Kilrats, where the family were from. There were 98 Presbyterians, going back to the United Irishmen. And James Armour said he remembered as a boy his father and them being aghast when they saw the local landlord evicting a young family and bringing the crowbar brigade on a day of snow. He said that the landlord and his men and their horses were well covered against the falling snow, but the hard-toiled man, he said, was turned out on the road, and in case his children got shelter, they demolished his house. And he said, when I saw this brutal act as a young boy, it must have been about 5 or 6, he said, I determined to drive a stake through the evil system of landlordism in Ireland. But that's Armour, who becomes a Presbyterian minister. He wanted to become a lawyer, campaigning on these issues, but his father wanted him to go for the Presbyterian Church. And he ended up for most of his life as the minister of Ballymoney, Trinity Church Ballymoney. And from there, he became a supporter of Home Rule, a Redmondite. He was a regular in the castle in the days of the liberal viceroyalty of Lord Aberdeen, who was a Scots Presbyterian. He was the chaplain to Lord Aberdeen. And F.J. Bigger approached him, Captain Jack White of Brushane, who had founded the Irish Citizen Army, whose father was Sir George White, a great military hero, but Jack was somewhere between an anarchist and a socialist, and Alice Stopford Green, who was a daughter of the Archdeacon of Meath. And he brought them all together and said, look, we're going to have a meeting in Ballymoney. We want a statement that will refute the idea that Protestantism in the north is interchangeable with unionism, with Carsonism. So they booked Ballymoney Town Hall. There was a meeting of about 600 local Protestants, local solicitors, big farmers. They were mainly what the police call in the reports men of stamp. There was a Union Jack on the table. They made speeches and they called for home rule for all Ireland. Now, a week or two later, James Craig arrived up with an orange band and tried to reclaim Ballymoney. Ballymoney was a different place then. North Antrim returned a home rule candidate in 1910. I mean, people forget that. It wasn't all Paisley country then. So the upshot was that they were all involved in that, and they produced the Covenant. And I found it in Alex Wilson's, in R.M. Henry's papers. R.M. Henry, Professor of Classics and Queen, brother of the artist Paul Henry. He and R.M. Henry's papers, and this is what it says. It's worth reading because it's a Protestant document like the Ulster Covenant of 1912, but different. We, the undersigned, Ulster Protestant men and women over the age of 16 hereby repudiate the claim of Sir Edward Carson to represent the united Protestant opinion of Ulster, reject the doctrine of armed resistance to the legitimate decrees of Parliament, i.e. Home Rule, and declare our abhorrence of the attempt to revive ancient bigotries and dying habits in this province. And here's the key line for today, for both sides of the community. We desire to live upon terms of friendship and equality with our Roman Catholic fellow countrymen, and in the event of the present measure for Home Rule becoming law, we are prepared to take our part with them in working for the good of our common country. It was signed by 3,000 people. The other covenant was signed by 500,000, but there you are.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating. Thank you, Harold, for the question. And
Thank you very much.
I didn't know that existed at all. I'm going to bring Robert in to ask a question, and then I see Ken and Kevin's hands up. So we'll bring Robert, Ken, then Kevin. So Robert.
Thanks, Conor. Éamon, another excellent talk. No, I'm just wondering, with Ballycastle being so close to the Western Isles of Scotland, had Roger Casement any links with places like Islay or Kintyre anywhere?
No, the Casements were Manx. They were from the Isle of Man. They were a Manx family. And until the early 20th century, the language of man, of the ordinary people, was really Ulster Irish. You know, it's almost like the Irish you would have got in the north of Ireland, declining by the late 19th century. So there was no Scottish connection. They were a Gaelic family, Casement, translated Casement. And of course, there's a Casement Street in Ballymena, which reflects the family's prominence. They were on the Loyalist side in 1798. They were married into the Church of Ireland. They became Church of Ireland gentry. But Casement had a mixed parentage, big house on both sides, but a Catholic aristocratic mother, a Protestant North Antrim landed father who had nationalist leanings. His father certainly wasn't a straight unionist at all, though an eccentric figure, and that's all very important. So no Scottish connection there at all, though Casement was Gaelic stock, very much aware of it, tried to learn Irish, you know. And I've heard recordings of Manx actually spoken. And it's very like Donegal Irish, you know, almost the same greetings and all of that. And that was Casement's background.
Thanks, Éamon.
Okay.
Do you know what part of the Isle of Man they came from?
No, that I don't know. I'll be honest. I'm sure I could find out, but off the top of my head, no.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Éamon. Ken, all the way from US of A via Ballymena.
Yes, well, being from Ballymena, I had to come in, and Casement Street, I went to school, Horrible Primary School in Casement Street. And folklore has it anyway that the Casement family lived in a big house between, at the end of Railway Street, really, and Queen Street, I guess it would be. And that the Ossison School, I believe, would have been right across the street where McBurney's Volkswagen garage was. Now, Horrible at the time is interesting because it was known as from Ballymena and the other end of the other side of the river, it was known as Sodom and Gomorrah. But I went to Ballymena Academy briefly, and oddly enough, I was many years later, I discovered that Roger Casement had also gone to the school. I remember.
That's right.
I remember being absolutely stunned that Roger Casement had gone to Ballymena Academy, and I could barely believe it. But not many monuments to him or much named after him as yet. But well, anyway.
Two things, and this is your day. This is definitely Ballymena's day on this series, actually. But as I say, the key thing was the Hugh Casement who married the rector of Ballinderry's daughter. His Anyway, Casement's great grandfather Roger lived at Harryville, so they had a house at Harryville, and of course he was the most famous old boy ever in the academy. And if Casement hadn't have got involved in Irish politics, so it'd be a portrait or a statue to him there today, because I mean he was the great humanitarian honoured by the Crown in 1910, and then of course he was shorn of his knighthood after his conviction for high treason in 1916. But very interesting, that connection. Harryville was their first home. Then the Adair Arms Hotel as a kind of a Ballymena. They had a floor there. And they were really living on their name. There wasn't much money by the time Roger was growing up, you know.
Very good, thank you. Kevin?
A couple of observations. One of which is that I was reading Angus Mitchell, who was the son of Mad Colonel Mitchell, was an MP.
Oh, yes.
He's done some research and he suggests that the diaries were a fake. I don't know if you've seen that.
Well, I have seen some stuff on that. I mean, I'm going really by tests that were done in 2001 they used various tests, scientific tests, and they found one diary, which was in a slightly different hand, had been obviously cooked by somebody in British intelligence with the trial in mind. But the other diaries were found, and so I think we're on a hiding to nothing today, trying to explain away the diaries as an invention of British intelligence. They certainly did some dirty work with they certainly used them to condemn Casement at a time when being gay was a criminal offence and something that was reprobated. They did that certainly by showing the diaries to key people. I mean, even in 1922, when Michael Collins visited London, he and O'Higgins were shown the diaries, and O'Higgins wrote back, it was totally disgusting, the detail. So the idea was, even in death, 6 years later, to excoriate Casement's reputation. But I think we can acknowledge that. But I think really, I knew many people who spent whole lives trying to repudiate the authenticity of the diaries. And I don't think it's possible, really.
Well, thank you. And the other point is, I don't know if you know the connection between a chaplain to George VI and the gun running in 1914 in Kilcool.
No.
The brother of, there was one brother who was Ralph Creed Meredith, who was a Church of England, or Church of Ireland, Church of England cleric, and he was in my town. He was the rural dean. My mother knew him, and I looked him up on the internet and found out his brother James
Creed Meredith was a judge.
Meredith was the gun runner.
Yes,
so
he was a judge later in the Free State. Yeah. Oh yes, well, I mean, well, that gun running you're talking about, Hoth and Kilcool, was organised by aristocrats. The Spring Rices were involved. Erskine Childers were involved. There were all people associated with the upper echelons of British society who had a sympathy with the Irish cause, not so much revolution as the Home Rule cause, which they felt was in danger. And certainly there's a number of people like that. You see, you find there are always schemes of the big houses who were sympathetic to nationalism, especially women. Although I should say Erskine Childers' wife, Molly, is believed to have been a British spy, and it's believed that he had been obviously a senior British official and then a British Army officer. But it's believed that during the treaty negotiations, Molly was actually providing reports to British intelligence about the thinking of the Sinn Féin delegation. Now, Erskine Childers will be executed later for his part in the Civil War by the Free State government.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Éamon. We've no other questions. A couple of reflections. Colin has said, you know, Casement, the most famous past pupil of Ballymena Academy, and then he says, present company excluded, # Ken Aiken. And then just at the end on, Julita has dug out the exact quote that her grandfather said in that Cork meeting. He basically asked the crowd, the quote was, will Rebel Cork deny Casement a hearing? Very, very good.
Yeah, but can I just say, Rebel Cork has nothing to do with Ireland, as Julita will know. Rebel Cork was because Cork in the, let's get this century right, in the 15th century supported a rival claim to the British throne. and became known as Rebel Cork. But it was rebel against the English crown with an imposter candidate. And yet we all think it's to do with republicanism. It's not.
Brilliant. Very, very good. Well, listen, folks, that's the end for today. Éamon, remind us, have we got one more left? Is that right?
Yeah, I think we have one next week on political misfits. I mean, there's plenty of mileage here. We can look at Jack White. We can look at the Presbyterian minister who toured America with De Valera. We can look at the Catholic Unionist, Sir Dennis Henry. So we'll have a wind up next week.
Very good.
Well, not quite a wind up. We'll wind up with political misfits. Thank you very much, Conor. Thank you all very much indeed. And keep safe. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I see Pat there. Bye-bye.